Okay, today we're going to open a can of worms and talk about ethnicity, nationalism, and citizenship. We're going to start off with a number of definitions because oftentimes these terms can be used accidentally to mean the same thing, but they aren't the same thing. And then we will talk about some major questions that political scientists have been asking about these issues of ethnicity, nationalism, and citizenship. So let's get started with some definitions. So the first one we're going to look at is ethnicity. You'll note for these slides that the summaries are taken from O'Neill's Comparative Politics textbook. I think he does a really good job of explaining the difference. So just so you know that text is from O'Neill. So ethnicity really emphasizes the person's relationship with other members in society. So it comes with a set of norms and specific standards of behavior that are key to how that person relates to other members of society. And so that can be things like language. Language facilitates how you relate to other people, religion, geographical location, customs, history, etc. Ethnicity is something that is passed down to you, so it's unlikely to change during your lifetime. It's just kind of something you get. You get your ethnicity, by birth, and then it's not something that's likely going to change very much. One thing that's important to remember is that in a country or in a state, you can have a lot of different ethnicities. In fact, most countries have a bunch of different ethnicities. So this map that you see here is looking at ethnic diversity in a variety of states. And so you can see that, there's a lot of countries that are very, very ethnically diverse and have a variety of ethnicities living within the same country's borders. The last thing to remember about ethnicity is that it's primarily social, not political. So you can be a specific ethnic identity and not have a political state, for example. So here's an example of Bosnia. So there's three main ethnic groups in Bosnia: the Croats, Serbs, and Muslims. And while they are different ethnic groups, they all speak the same language, for example. So ethnicity, you can have very common factors that you'd think would unite you, but in reality, be very different ethnic groups. And so in this case, in Bosnia, what divides them instead is religion. So the Croats are mostly Roman Catholics, Serbs, Eastern Orthodox, and Muslims obviously practice Islam. But religion doesn't necessarily divide elsewhere. So for example, in Germany, there's this division between Protestants and Catholics, but they're all Germans. So it can be very arbitrary. Maybe arbitrary is the wrong word, more like it can be very confusing to understand why does ethnicity seem to divide people on some lines but not other lines. And it's really hard for scholars to figure out where ethnicity catches on and where it doesn't. The next key term we want to take a look at is national identity or nation. And so this is an institution that binds people together through political aspirations. So this is a much more political term, but not entirely political. So it often comes in the form of looking for self-governance. So you want to have some sort of control over your internal affairs. Usually it's going to stem from some idea of being an oppressed or minority group that wants equality or wants some sort of control over what's going on inside their borders or inside their nation. It can often develop from ethnic identity, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And it also doesn't necessarily align with citizenship or the state. So again, we know that ethnicity and nationalism are not necessarily the same thing. So an example where ethnic identity does not necessarily match national identity would be, for example, American identity or Canadian identity. We think we're Canadian, but that doesn't necessarily match with a specific ethnicity. And we talk about a national Canadian identity that's even multicultural. So the idea that multiculturalism actually becomes the underpinning of that national identity. Rather than a specific ethnicity, we say the fact that we have a variety of ethnicities is what actually underpins our national identity. And this is, of course, the basis for what we call nationalism. So that's that pride in a people or beliefs that there's a unique political identity for this particular people. So one example could be Quebec. So this is a picture from the 95 referendum. So this is a good example of where a nation doesn't necessarily line up completely with a state. We know that Quebec is a province within Canada, but is still a nation. So this idea that the French-speaking population in Canada has its own ethnic group in the province of Quebec. So they're distinctly English-speaking. They're distinct from English-speaking Canada, but also distinct from French-speaking France. So it's its own group. In the 1960s, especially, we see this sense of national identity growing, and this minority in Canada starting to look towards having more control and more self-governance, to the point that it did lead to 2 referendums in 1980 and 1995, and is a continuing area of debate of having self-governance for this particular nation that does extend from an ethnic group in the sense that it's a distinct French-speaking minority within Canada. So the last term in our definitions is citizenship. So here we finally have a purely political term. So remember when we talked about the social contract, when we talked about the growth of democracy and the fact that you're willing to give up some of your powers to the state, and in return, the state is going to give you certain protections or whatnot. So again, citizenship is this idea that the individual is swearing allegiance to the state, and then the state provides benefits back. So this often involves both rights and obligations. So a right might be the right to vote, that, I have a right to live in this particular place. I have certain rights to be protected from violence. But there also includes certain obligations, so perhaps a responsibility that you have to pay taxes, or that there's compulsory military service in some places. So citizenship is kind of part of this exchange, and this is purely political because it's purely based on the state and your relationship with the state. In theory, an individual can change citizenship from one state to another. So we likely know many people who had a different citizenship and then became a Canadian. It's also possible to have multiple citizenships. However, not all countries recognize this. And so for an example, I'm actually going to send you over to a video. It's really fun, interesting video about some places where it's really difficult to get citizenship. I was kind of going down to look at Swiss citizenship because I know that it involves community recognition. I thought that was interesting. So this video has Swiss, Austrian, and I think Japanese citizenship, and how you get that citizenship and how hard it is and what the success rates are. So head over to that video for an example of some of the more interesting or unique rules regarding citizenship around the world. All right, so now that we have those 3 terms under our belt, so ethnicity, the idea of a person's relationship with others, members of society based on things like language or religion or geographic location, versus national identity, which is people coming together for political aspirations, to have some sort of control over internal affairs, often but not always stemming from ethnic identity. And then citizenship, which is this purely political idea of you have a relationship with the state, that you swear allegiance to the state, and the state then provides you benefits. So we have those 3 terms under our belt. So let's look at a few of the key questions that scholars have been asking about these 3 terms and how they work in the real world. So first of all, the question is, well, where did ethnic and national identity come from? So you'd actually be surprised that it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Prior to the 18th century, the primary identity for most people was an even smaller group than a nation or an ethnicity. It would be a family or a tribe or a village, something much smaller. And you can see why that would be the case, because there was a little bit less movement, and you would have a smaller conception of who your people were. But then remember we talked a little bit, again, in the state video about how there's a variety of different ways that we understand how the state came to be. And part of that for most scholars is the growth of urban centers. So the growth of trade or the growth of militarism resulting in the growth of urban centers. So with the rise of the modern nation state, these centers of trade or cities would allow for a standardization of language, culture, religious practice, etc., etc. And so these common norms and activities became a focal point for the new state. And it also became possible to encourage kind of devotion to this new state through a sense of national identity. And so actually national and ethnic identity are relatively new in terms of the grand history of the world. So even a country, that we would think of as always being, one ethnic identity, or what, for example, Germany. You think, okay, well, Germany is German is an ethnic identity. It's German is a nationality. That really only came to be as different states or different jurisdictions, different provinces came together to form a national or a united Germany. So actually, ethnicity and national identity is a relatively recent concept. But despite being recent, a lot of scholars have said, well, why does it persist even in an era of globalization and development? We kind of thought that we'd lose our sense of national identity, that you would cease to feel most connected to those who are closest, sharing language or geography, and instead have much more global connections. And you can see that with the growth of the internet, with the growth of trade. In an era of globalization, why is there any reason anymore to have this persistent feeling of belonging specifically to an ethnicity or to a nationalism? And what scholars have suggested is that in many cases, this globalization actually caused a retrenchment of national identity, very much as a reaction to this globalization, that people can feel that they're lost in such a large global environment, that there's so much change going on. And so what you do then is you cling to nationality for a sense of identity and a sense of stability despite this. So there's lots of arguments that even though we thought maybe nationality would disappear with things like even supranational unions, we talked about that, for example, the EU and the creation of a European identity that you can see in a lot of places. I mean, Brexit is a clear example that a lot of countries are moving back to more of a retrenchment of a specific UK identity, for example. And seeing themselves as not wanting to have this global identity and then clinging to that national identity instead. Another question is, well, where does conflict between ethnicities come from? And why does it emerge in some places and why does it not emerge in other places? So this area of ethnic conflict is a whole scholarly field in and of itself. We could do an entire course on it, so you're just kind of getting the one slide view of this. And it really stems from this idea that we see some violence erupt along ethnic lines in some places, but we don't see it in other places. And one response to this question is that it's this difference between whether ethnic conflict is being derived from a top-down view or a bottom-up view. So a top-down view suggests that elites are what drives ethnic conflicts. So it begins among political leaders and spreads down to society. And so you can see political leaders are using national rhetoric as a way to garner support. That's a good way to get people fired up for your cause and willing to support you. The alternative, of course, is the bottom-up view and suggests that ethnic conflict begins among people and then later spreads to the government. So it'll emerge over local disputes over resources or political rights or whatnot. And then that spreads up to the highest levels of government. So the example that I would give is the different groups in Iraq. So after the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, 3 provinces were put together into current-day Iraq. And you can see them kind of outlined here based on the Kurds, the Sunni Arabs, and the Shia Arabs. And a lot of ethnic conflict arose, partially because of local and bottom-up conflict or differences between the groups, but then also a top-down pitting of groups against each other by political leaders as a means to attain power. So both of these phenomena can be in place at the same time. Short answer is we don't, ethnic conflict arises in some places, it doesn't in others, and scholars could spend their entire careers trying to figure out why that's the case. One kind of potential answer that we get to ethnic conflict is, well, why don't we just draw better borders? So we saw in the case over here of Iraq that after World War I, we drew some borders around a country and said, okay, go be country. Well, why don't we just draw better borders? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, I guess it's a very logical response to think, well, we just need better post-colonial borders for that a lot of borders were really poorly drawn post-colonialism, and they were either dividing up ethnic groups into a bunch of different countries and then not having one particular ethnic group. Sometimes it was very arbitrary. But the problem, of course, is even if you do this, a lot of groups share the same territory. So here's an example. Post-Soviet, they were trying to draw up these borders between Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. And the way that they were best able to do it, you get these little pockets of Uzbekistan in the middle of Kyrgyzstan, for example. And so it's very messy. It's not quite as easy to draw borders as you think, because a lot of groups are sharing the same sorts of territories. And a lot of times a territory won't just have one ethnic group living in it. So it's not like you can just kind of, draw a border and tell everybody, okay, you live on this side if you're part of this ethnicity, live on the other side if you're part of that ethnicity. Sometimes you can subdivide to the point that it kind of defeats the purpose of a state. I mean, it's very difficult to run a state that has little enclaves in another state. And so this issue of just drawing better borders, as much as it's a tempting response to ethnic conflict, is not always the easiest solution. So stemmed by looking into Iraq and the different ethnicities living in Iraq, I came across this debate about colonial borders in the Middle East. So this is an online debate between somebody who was writing for The Atlantic, and then this is just a blog from a freelancer who later explains badly drawn borders are still a problem. This guy says, stop blaming the borders. So I'm going to suggest that you go take a look at this online debate looking at the drawing of borders, ethnicity, nationalism, and citizenship. It's fascinating. And then as a bonus, just at the end, I went down this rabbit hole of political borders in the Middle East and ethnicity and power. So I'm going to send you also to a video about what's going on in the Middle East right now and the variety of powers going on that exist, and how ethnicity has been used by key players being Saudi Arabia and Iran, as a way to fuel conflict, and how this Shia-Sunni division was kind of used as a top-down approach to, in the fight between political leaders. So I really went down a rabbit hole on this one. So I think it's a good example, and so I'm going to send you there. So that's the basics of what we have today in terms of ethnicity, nationalism, and citizenship. Once you've taken a look at the debates over borders and the debate here about the Middle East, you can head over to the quiz, and we will chat more in class.